We're now back live on YouTube for our weekly Lunch and Learn. And this week's class, the official title is When Reason Understands, You Still Get Confused. If it's so moral, why do we need the Torah? Um, Talking about some of the ethics in this week's Torah portion, uh, Parshas Mishpatim. And as I titled it on YouTube, why I dislike Fiddler on the Roof, because it gives the wrong portrayal of how Judaism ought to be celebrated. And so it's understandable why some people view Judaism through that sort of prism, but I take issue with it, and we'll see why. So many of us are confident that our moral compass is stable and clear, and that straight reason is enough to distinguish between good and evil. But in this week's Torah reading, we find something very interesting, which is that the Torah commands us as a divine decree, even about laws that seem self-evident. And we're going to explore the shortcomings of relying solely on human reason, and that we're going to show how even in the complex relationship between Israel and Germany after the Holocaust, morality can become too flexible when it's relying solely on human reason. And so we're going to learn why, without anchoring in the Na'aseh v'Nishma approach, the we will do and then we will listen of Mount Sinai, even the most enlightened logic can bend, and we have to accept God's authority for what's true ethics and morality. So in last week's Torah reading in Parshas Yisro, we read about the incredible awe-inspiring event of the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. And there God revealed himself to the Jewish people. He gave the Ten Commandments. There's thunder, lightning, there's flames, clouds. It was a whole to-do. It was an extremely dramatic event. Smoking mountains. I mean, it was quite the sight to behold. I've never watched the movie Ten Commandments, but I'm sure they focus a lot on the scenery. I don't know. Have you watched it?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's good.
It shows a lot of the smoking and the
Yeah, and
the,
I've been
the
to
thunder,
Universal
lightning
Studios where they have the Red Sea opening up,
parted.
and you
Okay.
drive with the tram through there.
Oh, that's cool.
So,
So that part of the movie is true. How they iterate Moses and the relationship with God and all of that, maybe, perhaps they need to open up a Rashi and a Rambam and other sources to really get an accurate depiction of what happened there. But the point is, God spoke to the Jewish people um, in a way that was a once on earth occurrence where God revealed himself to human beings en masse, and it's unparalleled. Never has been, never will be again, where you have this mass revelation, which, just sidebar, that's what's unique about the Jewish tradition, is that we have the same tradition that each of our ancestors claim to have been there at that revelation. Every other religion has one guy in isolation saying, "This is what God told me." Well, prove it to me. Right? But the Jews are able to say, "Well, my father was there, your father was there, your mother was there. We were all there." In fact, our teachings tell us that every Jewish soul for eternity was present there, even if they weren't born yet. So it was an incredible event. But after that special moment, the Torah begins this week's Torah portion called Mishpatim, with a long list of laws talking about things such as commerce, um, loans, just mundane money matters, damages, uh, justice systems, things like that. And that's if you want to read source one, that's the opening of this week's Torah portion.
these are the laws that you shall set before them. Should you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall work for 6 years, and in the seventh year he will go out to freedom without charge.
Okay, so it talks a lot about monetary law, and again, this is in the time when people would have servants that lived with them, which is actually it often was the case that Jews would buy out slaves in order to upgrade their life from where it was before. The Torah mandates a whole slew of laws in how to treat your quote unquote slave, which basically it says actually when you acquire a slave, it's like you're acquiring a master because there's so many requirements that come along with that. But after about 100 verses in this week's Torah portion talking about laws between people, the Torah goes back to say, hey, I forgot some details, or at least that's what it looks like. This is what happened at the giving of the Torah. Moshe approaches the mountain with Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu and the 70 elders, and only Moses goes up into the cloud. And when he returns, he tells over the words of God and tells the Jewish people, you can't touch the mountain. And the Jews say, we will do, right? We'll do whatever God tells us. Here in source 2, God says to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, the 70 of the elders of Israel, and prostrate yourselves from afar. Moses alone shall approach God, but they shall not approach. In other words, even those other holy, lofty men don't get to go in, and the people shall not ascend with him. So Moses came and told the people all the words of God and all the laws, and all the people answered in unison and said, all the words that God has spoken, we will do. So, to clarify, going up on the mountain was only done by Moses. The revelation, actually, the first 2 commandments were the only ones that the people heard, but they couldn't handle it, so they told Moses, whoa, we weren't expecting that much. That was intense. I don't know how you do this every day, but how about you take over and tell us the other 8 commandments, and then, of course, the other 603 commandments over the span of many days and years that they were in the desert. But Rashi comments, all the words of God, what does that mean? The command to separate from their wives and maintaining distance from the mountain, which was required for the duration of the giving of the Torah ceremony and for 3 days prior. So this is all towards the end of Parshas Mishpatim, this week's Torah portion. And there seems to be a strange gap where you have the story of the 10 Commandments talks about, and then not building altars a certain way. Then it goes into all these person to person law, and then it goes back to this whole narrative of Moses going on the mountain and this and that. And then it says that Moses built an altar. He sets up 12 pillars for each of the tribes of Israel, brings sacrifices, he sprinkles some of the blood of each sacrifice upon the altar, which would become the tradition whenever sacrifices were brought. Also, there was some sprinkling of the blood on the people, which was a sign of a covenant between God and the people. And he writes down the words of the Torah from the story of creation up until that day. He later finished the Torahs before his passing, and he reads it out loud to the people. And look in source 3, he took the book of the covenant and read it within the hearing of the people. In other words, where they can hear it. And they said, all that God spoke we will do, and we will listen. Says Rashi, what's the book of the covenant? What book? He didn't write Deuteronomy. He didn't write the book of Numbers. They hadn't traveled through the desert. Right. All the sacrifice in Leviticus hadn't happened. The building of the tabernacle hadn't happened. So what did he tell them? From Genesis until the giving of the Torah and the commandments, they had been instructed at Marah, which was one of the earlier stops from Egypt on the way to Sinai. They got like the commandment of Shabbat they received in Marah. So all of this happened before the giving of the Torah, Rashi explains. Here in source 4, to Moses he said, this was said before the 10 Commandments. On the 4th of Sivan, Moses was told to ascend. Now, chronologically speaking, it would make sense for all of this entire episode to be recorded in last week's Torah portion in order before the giving of the Torah, saying this is what happened before. So this is where the well-known principle is invoked, Ein mukdam u'mu'achar b'Torah. There is no earlier and later in the Torah. The Talmud and the Medrash talk about this, saying that the order of the sections of the Torah is not always chronological. And sometimes it'll say something later that occurred earlier, or vice versa. Even in last week's Torah portion, it talks about Yisro coming to meet the Jews when they left Egypt. And then it talks about Yisro teaching his son-in-law Moses about the art of delegation. But that actually happened 3 months after the giving of the Torah. But yet it's recorded before the giving of the Torah. So it's not exactly in chronological order. So Rashi is also explaining that that this whole iteration of the commandments up until the Ten Commandments and the Jews saying we will do and we will listen actually happened before the Ten Commandments, before the grand show of God's revelation upon Sinai. So although it's written in a later chapter, it actually happened chronologically earlier. But the question is, why? Why is the Torah written in such a confusing manner? Is it just to confuse us? To say, well, you thought you knew something? I got another thing coming, right? So, the simple answer is that there's a lesson to be learned from the particular order that it's written in. Okay, and well, just across the board, there's a general lesson, which is that the Torah is not here to teach us history. The Torah is not historia, as we say in Hebrew, but the Torah is hora'ah, which means a lesson. It's actually etymologically related to the word hora'ah. Torah is the same word. So we have to really open a discussion on the nature of the commandments, and then the answer to this question will be more clear. So this is some of the very, very, I would say, basics. I don't like the word Chabad theology, but something that is very often repeated in Chabad writings. But it's not actually Chabad. Actually, it goes back to Maimonides and Nachmanides, the way these things are categorized. But this text over here is from the Rebbe here on page 3. Okay. The Rebbe talks about 3 categories of mitzvot. So it's known that there are 3 categories of commandments, and they are decrees, testimonies, and laws. Okay, so decrees, well, the Hebrew term for that is chukim. Decrees is also a crossover between statutes, very firm thing. Decrees are matters that are beyond human understanding, as in the phrase, I have issued a decree and established a statute. You have no authority to question it. That's it. You can't mix wool and linen in your garments. Why? Because it's a decree. It's a decree. B, testimonies. Edot. Actually, it's also the same word for witnesses. It's also edim. So you have an aid is a witness. So testimony, right, is the same word. Testimonies are practices that are performed as a remembrance of a significant past event. However, these are matters that depend on a person's wishes. They aren't logical necessities. If people wish, they create a remembrance for something, and if they don't wish to, they don't. So, an example of that would be, like, you remember when we left Egypt and the dough didn't rise? Like, you know what? Let's have a thing where every year we eat unleavened bread, right? So whoever created that event, in this case God, said, hey, let's celebrate that. Let's remember that by eating unleavened bread every year, right? So it's a testimony to something that happened in the past. Now, it's not a logical necessity. Like, maybe Passover should just be celebrated by reading the passage from the Torah or praying 4 extra hours on that day every year. Why does the celebration necessitate eating matzah? Because it's a testimony. It's a commandment from God, but it's one that, it makes sense. It's not a logical necessity, but it makes sense, right? It's a testimony, or even Shabbat, observing the Sabbath. It's a testimony that God created the world in 6 days and he rested on the 7th, right? So it's not completely illogical. It's not just a decree that's not based in any reason whatsoever, but it's also not intuitive. Yeah, if you're there, imagine you're I don't know, the heavens and earth that were there from day one, and you're like watching like all these things happen, plants, trees, moon, stars, people, animals. It's like, wow. Your instinct isn't going to be like, oh, let's do Shabbat. Like, it's not like a thing that happens in your head, right? It's something that the creator of the world says, this happened. Now I want you to remember that, to give testimony to that incident, to that event by doing this commandment. And then category C is mishpatim, laws. Laws are matters that human reason itself obligates a person to follow. For this reason, they are called rational commandments. For example, the laws discussed in this week's Torah portion, the punishment of a thief, the laws governing guardians, like saying, if you're a paid guardian, then you bear responsibility even if the object is stolen or lost, right? If you're held at gunpoint and the object was taken from you, you don't bear any responsibility, right? If you borrowed something from someone and you didn't pay them to be able to borrow it, they're just doing you a favor, and the object got stolen or lost, then you bear responsibility, right? So these are logical laws that the Torah does, specify and iterate clearly, but these are in the categories of rational commandments. This is also the meaning of the term laws, mishpatim, legal rulings. The definition of a legal ruling or a din is that it is not something dependent on a person's choice, whether one wishes to comply or not. Rather, when a court issues a ruling, it must be carried out. So Moses commands the laws concerning this. You want to continue reading on the
Under this is also
no, the next page,
next page.
page 4.
Just a quick step back.
Yeah,
Mitzvah.
commandments.
Okay, that means command.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and then there's 3 categories within the commandments.
Moses commands the laws. Concerning this, it is said to Moses, these are the laws that you shall place before them. Meaning, even though these are commandments that human reason itself obligates, Moses still had to command them to the Jewish people in the name of God. This is especially evident in light of what is explained in the Midrash, which Rashi cites in his commentary on the Torah. Whatever the term "and these" is used, it comes to add to what came before it. Just as the earlier ones, the 10 Commandments, in the portion of Yitro, were given at Sinai, so too these, the laws in this portion, were given at Sinai. At first glance, this seems contradictory. After all, if something was given at Sinai, then it makes no difference whether it is a decree or a law. Everything given at Sinai must be observed. On the other hand, if a law is obligated by human reason, then why is there any need for a command from Sinai at all? As the Talmud states in the Tractate Yurvin, if the Torah had not been given, we would have learned proper conduct even from animals.
Okay. So this is like the category of law that like nobody's agreeing with the facts. Like, sorry, nobody's disagreeing with the facts that you have to, give back an object that you borrowed, or that you bear responsibility if you were negligent when somebody did you a favor and lent you something, that you have to, reimburse him if something happens, right? These are logical things that theoretically, had the Torah not been given, it would make sense to us, right? Even something as maybe less obvious, but also intuitive, which is more modesty, and being a mensch. We can learn certain things from animals. It says certain animals they don't steal from each other. Ants, they you can learn teamwork from ants, right? You can learn modesty from a cat. A cat doesn't defecate in a public area, a dog walking down the street lifts its leg, and but a cat does it in a private way, right? So we can learn these kind of things from animals and from, intuition and things like that. Um, but yet the Torah does say them. Keep reading. Yet,
Yet, even the laws that reason itself obligates are stated in the Torah as having been given at Sinai. There is nothing superfluous in the Torah, just as nothing is missing from it. Nothing extra was added to it. There is a general principle that God can create anything in the world in vain. And this is all the more clear regarding the Torah. Since there can't be anything superfluous, it must be the case that we cannot rely on the obligation imposed by reason. There must be that a command in the Torah adds something new and fundamental, even to matters that are already required by human beings.
okay. So from the very fact that the Torah chooses to command us, or God chose to command us by writing in the Torah things that are understandable to human reason, we learn that even things that the intellect could arrive at on its own are reinforced and given meaning when they're given as a divine command. But there's more to that. It's more than, oh, okay, fine. It's it's added motivation, if you will, because God commanded me, so now I'm more motivated. There's got to be something much more definitional about the fact that it's given by God, more than just, oh yeah, fine, I'm now more motivated knowing that God told me to do this. So on page 6, the Rebbe goes into morals and ethics must be absolute, and this is something that the Rebbe preached over and over and over again, and we'll see the crossover to uh, Nazi Germany or even 1972 Germany in Munich, and how that um, how understanding the Torah's values in contrast to what's out there really gives you an appreciation for why we're even studying the laws of, oh, if you borrow this you have to pay back, and if you take somebody's pajamas as collateral you have to give it back to them every night so they can sleep in it, even though you're going to go and take it back from them in the morning until they pay back the loan. Things that, like, seriously, God in heaven has to go tell me about somebody's pajamas and his pillow, like, but yes, absolutely. Every single thing is divinely ordained because it matters that it comes from God. Let's see. The Rebbe explains. The explanation of this, albeit briefly, is as follows. The purpose of any intellectual matter is that it should not remain only in the realm of thought, but should also be carried into actual behavior. Study is meant to lead to action, meaning that the way a person acts in practice should follow the dictates of logic. This is why we need a commandment in the Torah. Without it, there can be obstructions that prevent what is understood intellectually from being carried out in practice due to the interference of various side considerations. Right? We all know the joke about the professor who was well, it's two jokes. The joke is about the rabbi who was talking about how we have to be kind to children and patient, and always preached tolerance and so forth. And thank God they were doing construction, and there was some wet cement in the corner of the yard with some yellow tape around it. And he comes outside and he notices that some of the kids are playing around in the cement, making shoe marks in it. And he blew a gasket and he starts yelling at these kids. And somebody tells him, Rabbi, you always preach kindness, tolerance, and it's like, listen here, all of that is good in theory, but not when it comes to the concrete. So, or another one. This I think is actually a true story. There was a professor who was talking about the ills of smoking and how it harms you, etc. And of course, after a long, stressful lecture, he goes outside and he goes for a smoke. One of the students asks him and it says, you seem like a hypocrite. Here you're talking about the ills of smoking, and here you are harming yourself. It says, and if I was a mathematician, does that make me a triangle? Like, there's theory and there's practice. Theory doesn't always lead to practice, right? Or theory doesn't always lead to the concrete, right?
Okay. That's a good.
So, so the point is, yes, there's a lot of mitzvahs that might be logically mandated. It might make sense. It might be intuitive, but that doesn't mean you're going to actually behave that way. So first and foremost, among these is the concept of bribery. In other words, among these side considerations is bribery. As the verse states, bribery blinds the wise and distorts the words of the righteous. The Torah of truth itself calls such a person wise and righteous. Can you imagine? It's saying that it blinds the wise and distorts the righteous, right? 1 second. If they're giving into the bribe, how are you calling them wise and righteous? This is not a case of someone who knows the truth and nevertheless acts against it. We are not dealing with wicked people. Rather, bribery blinds people's eyes so that they are incapable of seeing the matter as it truly is, and instead develop a different understanding of it. In other words, since this is a wise and intellectual, capable person, there's no reason for his intellect itself to change. And indeed, his intellect does not change. The effect of bribery is that the person doesn't perceive the situation properly. They see open, but they don't know whether it is a door leading to a good place, the opening of a pit into which they might fall. Right? That's the nature of blindness. You feel a door, but you can't see past the doorway, right? So let's see, when was this talk given? I'm just trying to look at the source. Okay, 1974. There you go. So with that in mind, we now continue with what the Rebbe segues into what was then the present time of the discussion, which is 19. So the Rebbe is talking about a new Germany, question mark. So there's no need for elaborate explanations regarding this point because we have seen this openly in our times. There was a nation which for many years was renowned and prided itself on excelling, especially in intellect and science, philosophy, and ethics. This is an important one, ethics. Precisely that nation used intellect and science for acts of cruelty against Jews. We all know about the Mengele experiments, right? Scientific experiments, right? In a manner completely opposed to basic humanity in the worst possible way, unlike anything found among other nations. To this very day, they do not express remorse for this. This is 1974. So there still wasn't a separation of East, there still was a separation of East Germany, West Germany, right? So the relationship of the Jewish people with Germany in 1974 was not exactly a very healthy one. Today, you have a menorah at Brandenburg Gate. It's all, it's all hunky dory. But immediately after World War II, there was a broad consensus in the Jewish world and the young state of Israel to completely boycott Germany. You ask my parents or your generation, any Jew would not buy a Mercedes Benz. I mean, it was out of the question. What are you crazy? You're going to support the Nazi regime? Granted, it doesn't have a swastika. It's a star. It's not, but still, in the Jewish world, that it was the Mercedes Benz logo was synonymous with the swastika. And the leadership of the state of Israel did a kind of a total severance of all contact with Germany. In the first 4 years after the establishment of the state of Israel, it even said in the Israeli passport, valid for all countries of the world except Germany. It was very intense. But on September 10th of 1952, there was an agreement signed between the state of Israel and West Germany. And according to that agreement, Germany agreed to pay Israel approximately 3 billion marks as compensation for the Jewish property that had been looted and for the suffering caused during the Holocaust. And this was to help rehabilitate Holocaust survivors, build the Israeli economy, which was nothing at the time. It was a bunch of farmers that, I mean, poverty was the norm in Israel in the beginning. But it also sparked a lot of controversy, and some of which was the most
used to provide reparation.
Yeah,
they gave Israel several submarines also.
Okay, wasn't sure about all the details. Um, but Menachem Begin, who opposed this agreement, um, and he led the Cheirut movement, who viewed the reparations money as blood money. It was he said, it's a desecration. It's like so. All you're trying to do is erase the history by saying, "Oh, here's a few bucks. Shh, be quiet." It's almost like a hush money payment for what happened for the 6 million Jews. Um, so
My dad was 52.
what's
He was
that?
in the Army of Occupation.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So there was even a slogan: the yellow star, a badge of honor; reparations and negotiations, a disgrace for generations. So that was the Begin and his movement, and not just him, but that side of the political debate expressed a lot of pain and anger over this financial agreement. On the other hand, you had Ben Gurion and the and his government, which supported the agreement, and they felt that it was an existential necessity for the economic boom of the state of Israel, and that even though it might feel controversial and whatnot, bottom line is you're helping actual survivors get back on their feet by using this money to build the Israeli economy, which many survivors had moved to. So that was kind of the two sides of this whole debate, which wasn't only a theoretical debate. Um, um, Begin called for rebellion. There was Dov Shilansky, who later became Speaker of the Knesset, who tried to plant an explosive device in the foreign ministry. Um, Lots of very excited demonstrations in the streets. Some protesters even wore yellow stars as a way to, show like this is better than what you're doing. Um, but there were a lot of very difficult and heated debates in the Knesset. Now, in the late 50s, um, security ties were also formed between Israel and Germany, like you mentioned, arms deals, exchanges of intelligence. Um, Initially, it was kept secret because it's controversial. You have this whole
Sure.
faction that's against any association with Germany, and it was only at a later stage, once some of these relationships had been developed significantly, that people found out, oh yeah, we actually have this arms agreement with Germany. And it's like, what? These Nazis, the even though they had changed, and but still. So people approached the Rebbe and asked the Rebbe his opinion. Was it appropriate for a Jew to accept reparations money from Germany? Um, and the Rebbe answered that this was first and foremost a moral question, not a religious one. Um, in practice, once the agreement was already signed by the State of Israel and Jewish organizations around the world were receiving that money, um, if an individual Jew says, "Oh, I don't want to take that money," it's not going to affect the beginning of the food chain of the money coming in. That already happened, and so the Rebbe said basically, practically, even though there might be room to object in negotiations in theory from an ethical, moral standpoint, but accepting the money um, is worthwhile because you're basically um, takes the stolen goods out of the hands of the thief, so to speak.
So they didn't look at it as a bribe. Cloud your vision. They thought,
Well, maybe on a governmental level it might be, but for an individual organization to receive that money from the Israeli government, that was the question. The Israeli government, Ben Gurion wasn't going to the Rebbe and asking him his opinion, but there were other individuals or organizations that were receiving the money or were eligible to receive the money. He went to the Rebbe and asked, can we take this money?
he's making a secular decision. It's not making the it's not making.
Who? Ben Gurion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Making a secular.
But religious Jews always consult with the religious authority before doing anything of even slight question. So now this reparations agreement and the later military agreements kind of helped establish a formal diplomatic relations between Israel and Germany. Now, of course, we all know what happened only a decade or so later during the 1972 Munich Summer Olympics. And the state of Israel sent um, representatives, athletes, to participate in the Olympics. Now, think about it. For the individual organizations to receive the money from the state of Israel, the Rebbe said, "Listen, the money was already given. You're not you rejecting the money is not going to cause Israel to get less money or to change the political scene over there. So take the money, get it out of the hands of bad people. Fine. But what about the state of Israel itself? Was taking money from Germany, like you said, considered bribery, right?
Mhm.
Especially considering comes 1972 and Germany wants to present itself. Look, we're a forward-thinking nation. We're a peaceful nation. We're hosting the Olympics, a worldwide international event. Come to us. We're the new, new and improved Germany, right? And the Rebbe had what to say about it. Here, look at source 5. Read it.
This event occurred in Germany, where 6 million Jews were killed by those claiming to be a superior nation. Why go there and participate and celebrate with them and try to curry favor with them and demonstrate a friendly relationship, despite knowing that they openly hate Jews? At the very least, they should have skipped this year's Olympics.
So, in other words, Israel should have skipped the Olympics.
One could argue that in the immediate post-war period, there was a need to maintain relations with Germany in order to receive reparations. But for this, there is no justification.
Right. So this was a reference to participating in the Munich Olympics. And I'm trying to see when this. Let me just look. It's easier to go through the paper than to scroll on the screen. But this talk was given. Yeah, this is after the whole thing happened. So you have on September 5th, which was 11th day of Elul in 1972, Palestinian terrorists known as Black September murdered 11 Israeli Olympians. They went into the Olympic Village and they first took them hostage, and it was an event that shook up the entire world and really shaped how the world views counterterrorism measures, and there were some failures on Germany's part. And after the murders, remember, this is the middle of the Olympics, which is a several week event, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a brief memorial ceremony was held, and after just about a day, the International Olympic Committee decided we're continuing with the rest of the games. And for the most part, the Olympics went on as usual. And the chilling slogan that they gave was "The games must go on." Like, 11 people were murdered, so what? The show must go on, right? Like, so this choice that just to go back to regular life as if nothing happened in Germany, in the shadows of the painful memory of the Holocaust, was it did not look well for Germany. I don't know if you remember those events, but
I was 69. I was just getting out of grammar school, so I was in my second year of high school.
Okay, so you weren't exactly a mature adult, but you still remember those events. And
I was in Stuyvesant High School in New York City, and most of my classmates were Jewish.
Right. So this was kind of like a further indictment on where Germany has or hasn't come since the Holocaust, right? So the Rebbe says that this position that Germany allegedly claims that we're a different Germany, and therefore they should be treated with affection and friendship and mutual relations, and to the point that Israel even participated in the Olympics in the first place, held on German soil, was a silly and flawed approach, which was motivated, of course, by Bribery. So this is what happens when you receive benefits, whether it's money or honor, even if it's disguised under the political or sporting interests, it clouds a person's judgment. That's the nature of bribery. We're not saying that you're a bad person. Remember, we said earlier, it's not the wicked accept bribery. It's that bribery blinds the righteous, right? So it causes people to stop seeing reality as it truly is. And suddenly our moral vision and our moral compass becomes very blurry, and you somehow choose to forget certain things, to kind of artificially separate the past from the present, which, sadly, had Germany demonstrated different behavior leading up to the attack and in middle of the hostage negotiations, which, Israel offered to bring in their special forces and they were turned down by Germany, and we were left with 11 dead Jews. So all of that, what does that say about Germany in that time? I'm not saying today in 2026.
Right.
We can have that discussion separately, but certainly at that time. So the rabbi continues, and yet there are those who plead in every possible way to be allowed to go to them and to cooperate with them, not only with regard to the purchase of weapons, but also in other areas such as sports, competitions, and the like. This is out of a desire to be like all other nations. Like all the nations, the house of Israel. Where does this come from? From Ezekiel 25:8. And this is a negative thing. Okay? For that the Jews want to be like everybody else, God forbid. Moreover, even after suffering the consequences once, they return and try again. This is in addition to the general principle that it is an established rule that Esau hates Jacob. It's like, don't take anyone's love for granted. Let them prove it to us. As evident even among the best of nations, despite witnessing the cruel conduct towards the Jewish people described above, they did not protest. Right? How long did it take for America to join the war? How many boats of Jews were turned down by America? Right? Therefore, special caution is required when bringing someone into a sensitive security position. There needs to be an investigation to determine whether they can be relied upon to help protect the Jewish people and rule out the concern that they might assist the opposing side. Right? This is what happened after October 7th. So many Jews went around asking, here I am, I'm cultured, I'm Americanized, I'm in the secular culture, I have all these friends, mostly who are not Jewish. But now I'm starting to second guess how many of these not Jewish friends of mine would you hide me? That was the big line. I don't know if you remember going around 2 years ago. Would you hide me? No. That was like a thought on the front of everyone's mind. Like, this was a real issue. So the Rebbe is saying, like, here you have a nation. This is Germany. This is not some other Western country. This is the country that committed the atrocities. Imagine, think of today. Would you, if in 2034 the Olympics were held in Gaza City, right? Would you send a Jewish delegation there, or would you say, it's only been 10 years. I'm not sure you've proven yourself long enough, right? Certainly, you would approach that with an extreme degree of caution, right? So that's basically what we're saying here, is that a normal, straight-thinking person would draw the line and say, listen, we'll take your money, maybe, yes, no, it's controversial, but we don't need to support your economy. We don't need to go there and have our representatives in your country. But anyways, the Rebbe goes on. At first, they argued that the contemporary people are the very same nation and that the obligation to remember and not forget what they did still applies. But after accepting bribes, they began to claim that now this is a different nation, different Germans, contrary to the truth that everyone knows that they have remained as they were. They make this claim only because bribery has completely distorted their judgment. With regard to bribery, and by the way, it pains me to say this, but I feel like this is what's happening now, playing out with Qatar and Israel and all these Trump and all everything that's going on, there's a lot of bribery that's happening, whether it's honor, whether it's money, but there's a lot of distorted thinking, and God should help us that the Israeli leadership should not give into any of this bribery and stand firm and be very clear that enemies are enemies until they're proven that they're not, and any sort of signed agreement and things like that means nothing, as we've learned from history. So
Ask the American Indian.
you're saying they also had an agreement?
We violated every treaty.
Yeah.
Not even one. We didn't get one agreement.
There you go. Yeah. We're living on stolen land, right? Anyways, so with regard to bribery, there's no greater bribe than a person's own sense of self-importance and self-worth, honor, and self-love. This can so thoroughly skew a person's reasoning that they are capable of doing things that are the very opposite of logic. So from the story with Germany, the Rebbe is showing how unstable human morality can be. People could be blinded by the bribe of money, honor, other personal interests, and suddenly change their positions on matters that were very clear and unequivocal just yesterday, and suddenly our judgment is clouded. And so that's where the Torah comes in. The Torah's intent is very clear. It's not enough that the laws be understandable to human reason. The Torah teaches us that even the mishpatim, the laws, the ones that are intuitive, are not intuitive. They have to be commanded. They have to be given divine authority. And that doesn't depend on the spirit of the time, external pressures, temporary gains. It doesn't get confused in the face of a bribe or other things. Moral stability is preserved when it's given from the top down. When God tells us to do something and tells us that this is the truth, that truth is maintained. And so this is where I go into the Fiddler on the Roof tangent, and that is, what's the big takeaway from the whole Fiddler on the Roof concept? It's, why do we do Judaism? Why do we do the traditions that we do? Because tradition, right? In other words, I ain't got no idea. I haven't got the faintest clue why I'm doing X, Y, and Z. But I'm doing it because. Now, of course, that's true. Of course, when it comes to you don't mix wool and linen in your garments, or you don't eat pork, or whatever it might be, yes, there has to be an element of, yes, we accept this. This is tradition. This is given to us from God, and we do it because we have to do it. That's it. But how far can you take that? How sustainable is that? That's why Maimonides wrote a whole book, Guide to the Perplexed, to try his best to give some sort of inkling of a reasoning, not necessarily that it's the accurate one. He says, disclaimer, this may not be accurate, but if it helps you do it, then so be it. And he writes that, why don't we mix wool and linen? Because there were certain priests, certain pagan priests, that this was their way of dress. They would mix wool and linen in their garments. So the Torah is telling us not to be like these pagans by having those kind of clothing. Now, has that been backed up by history? I don't know, and I'm not here to criticize Maimonides. God forbid, who am I? But the point is that if that helps somebody say, oh, okay, fine, I can make sense of it, great. The bottom line is, don't wear such a garment, because the Torah says you can't. You have a reason, and that makes it easier for you, gesundheit, let that be. But this whole notion of Judaism is all about tradition. It's what happens is you have a bunch of people who their whole Judaism is watching Fiddler on the Roof. And they don't do one darn thing that the people in Fiddler on the Roof were actually doing, because that whole tradition reasoning doesn't work for them. So here's where the Rebbe says this in his words. Let's see. Why don't you read this one, page 10. The lesson.
The lesson we learn from the portion of the Mishpatim is that even with regard to laws that are understood with human logic. The Torah emphasizes that these two were given at Sinai, meaning that they contain an element that transcends reason.
Okay, so here the Rebbe is talking about the flip side, that even things as obvious as certain morals and ethics and business arrangements have to be infused and inspired by and really done from A to Z only because God told us to do it. Because otherwise, we might be bribed, we might be clouded, we might not have the clear vision and judgment that we should have. So having it as a divine authoritative commandment it necessitates that we stick to it no matter what other bribery or side influence comes in. But on the other hand,
At the same time, although these two were given at Sinai, beyond reason, they are nevertheless laws that are intelligible to reason. This is because the Torah demands understanding and intellectual comprehension. Torah is supposed to be understood, and the verse states, "It is your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the nations." Moreover, intellect is the most precious thing a person possesses, and therefore it must be used in the service of God. Our sages said, "The world was not worthy to make use of gold, so why was it created? For the temple?"
No, that is the answer. It was created for temple use. Otherwise, there's no point in having gold.
Okay,
Yeah.
it's valid for them.
In other words, there's no point in having brains, human brains,
If you don't use them.
if you don't use them for God.
Right.
Right.
Or the line that I've often heard is, "I can explain it to you, but I can't understand it for you."
Exactly. So each of us has to understand it. But what he's saying is, if we're just more developed mammals, then what's the point of us being more developed? The point is that mammals can't do mitzvahs. We can do mitzvahs.
Similarly, the world was not worthy to make use of intellect. It was given only for understanding and comprehending the Torah. It was not given in order to toil intellectually on figuring out how to earn another dollar in order to buy a nicer home or finer possessions. Therefore, we must strive to understand and grasp the Torah to the full extent our intellect allows. But the foundation of this effort is the principle that these two were given at Sinai. This is why the portion of the Mishpatim comes after the portion of Yitro, which recounts the giving of the Torah at Sinai, and concludes with the section about the altar of earth and the altar of stones. This teaches us that even earth and stones, inanimate materials, can be made into an altar for God. Following this comes the portion of the Mishpatim, teaching that we make an altar for God even out of matters that descend into and are expressed through human reason, by connecting them to something that transcends reason.
Okay, so what we're saying is that the most earthly physical things have to be used for something spiritual, whether it's a earth that's made into an altar or it's our brains that are our brain cells that are rubbed together in order to appreciate God's wisdom. So back to the question which we opened the lesson with, which was why does this story of Na'aseh and Nishma, we will do and we will listen, why is it said specifically after this whole series of mundane person-to-person law in this week's Torah portion of Mishpatim, which is after Moses comes down from the mountain and teaches all these laws governing relationships between people. Chronologically, this Na'aseh and Nishma declaration was made 2 days before the giving of the Torah. So what's the lesson in posting it, in writing it in the Torah after all these laws that were given much later? So the Rebbe says, and this is the caption of, "We will do and we will listen even regarding rational commandments." Based on this, we can also understand why the concept of stating "we will do" before "we will listen" appears specifically in the portion of Mishpatim. At first glance, this seems out of place in Mishpatim, both in terms of chronology and content. Chronologically, the declaration of "we will do" before "we will listen" was made before the giving of the Torah in the previous portion. In terms of content, placing "we will do" before "we will listen" would seem relevant only before hearing, not after one has already heard. You'd think like you just heard, like, okay, you have to return lost objects, you have to pay back loans, you have to treat your servants in certain ways, you have to pay your employees on time, like, okay, like you can't hit your parents, like okay, yeah, I mean, obviously, but somehow deliberately the Torah tells us after all those obvious laws, we will hear and we will listen. Tells us the story of the Jews saying that. Why? Although it is true that the Torah is not bound by chronological order, this does not mean that the Torah was written in an orderless manner. As the Shalah writes, any departure from chronological order requires a reason and explanation. So what's the reason and explanation why "we will do" and "we will listen" comes after all these seemingly obvious intuitive laws? The Rebbe says the reason for the appearance of "we will do" and "we will listen" in this portion is that the Torah wishes to emphasize that even in matters that are understood by human reason, we must do before we listen. So that's a very profound principle. Even laws that are understandable to human reason, like honoring your parents, laws of property damage and things like that, we don't observe them only because they make sense, but we observe them first and foremost, we will do. We will do, in other words, this is God's commandment. We will do it because of the divine authority and our faith in God, that this is what we have to do. Now, when we go with that approach, when we go with a "we will do" first approach, then the "we will listen." In other words, our process of human comprehension will be assured that it doesn't veer off through bribery and other paths where it just, where we become so open-minded that our brains fall out, right? It allows that our human intellect doesn't get misguided by personal interests, which distorts the truth, and self-bribes and things like that. And so the idea is that even the mishpatim, even these seemingly obvious things like, yeah, don't be cruel, pay your employees on time, if you borrow money, pay it back, if you find a lost object, try to find the owner, if somebody does you a favor, don't screw them over, like things like that. Like, it's obvious, but why do we do it? We do it because God said so, because God said so. Okay, we'll do it, and then we will listen. In other words, and then we'll try to comprehend it, and then we'll approach it with a rational, reasonable approach. Even the mundane things. We're not even talking about mixed wool and linen and not eating pork and other things that are much beyond reason. Even the very reasonable things, we have to take a "we will do" approach first. And the Rebbe continues, this is the meaning of the sage's teaching: do not sit and weigh the commandments of the Torah against each other. At first glance, with regard to laws that are understandable by reason, there would seem to be room to reason that it is worthwhile to give up a quote-unquote lighter matter in order to gain a more quote-unquote weightier one. Therefore, the Torah emphasizes that the lightest of the light is like the most serious of the serious, even though the Torah itself describes one as light and the other as serious. So that's the point. When we're going by our own reason, then we start to be distorted by all sorts of things. Certain things are disinteresting and things like that. And then you have, like Fiddler on the Roof. I can't do this anymore. It's too difficult. It doesn't make sense. I don't feel it anymore. I'm not in the mood.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But that's the problem. That's the problem when your whole foundation is just tradition. Yes, that's a good beginning, but that has to come into human reason. It has to lead you to appreciate and to study and to understand, why are we doing all these things? Why do we do all those traditions? And when we have that sequence of "we will do" and then "we will hear," that's the surest way to ensure Jewish continuity, Jewish survival, and that our traditions remain steadfast, that we're not confused by bribery and other sort of outside influences. So that's the lesson from this week's Torah portion and the sequencing of all the writing